Hi everyone, welcome to my new webinar. Today, our guest is Jenny Bhatnagar, who is a microbial ecologist at Boston University. She has a background that combines biology, chemistry, and biogeochemistry, and she leads a research lab at BU that aims to understand how microorganisms drive ecosystem processes such as nutrient and carbon recycling, and she specifically focuses on fungi in her research. Thank you, Jenny, for being part of this interview. Your insights are very valuable to us.
Oh, thank you for having me.
So, before asking any specific questions about your research, I'm curious about your story. How did you first get interested in studying fungi?
Yes. Well, it took a little while. I was always interested in the environment, in nature. And so I was a chemistry major in college, and everyone else in my program went into the medical field or into pharmaceuticals. I was the only one that was interested in the chemistry of the environment. And folks didn't quite know what to do with me. So, to get research experience, I ended up working with a forest ecologist, somebody who specialized in the study of trees. And so I started my scientific journey learning a lot about trees and tree chemistry. And I really thought trees were the most important part of an ecosystem because I grew up in New England. We have a lot of trees around here. And the trees do a lot of photosynthesis in forests, right? So they're pulling a lot of CO2 out of the atmosphere. They're making sugar for the rest of us, for all other living things on Earth. So I thought they were the major controllers of the carbon cycle. It took a few years for me to learn about microorganisms and the role that they play, and particularly fungi. The person I was working with at the time, this forest ecologist, really encouraged me to consider graduate school and to work with specifically with a fungal ecologist who was an assistant professor at that time, a new professor, and was studying this kingdom, the fungi, in soils in a way that folks hadn't really done a lot of before. And I was very resistant because I wanted to study plants. I thought plants were it. But a couple things happened. One is that I met Kathleen, my future PhD advisor, who is the fungal ecologist. And, um, she made a big impression on me. And I knew sort of as soon as I met her that I wanted to learn from her. So that was one thing. And the second thing is that, I just started to learn more and more. It wasn't really until the end of my PhD that I realized how much I needed to understand fungi as organisms. Up until then, I had been thinking of them as little chemical machines that take dead plant material and turn it into CO2 and turn it into other molecules, or, kind of take proteins out of soil and crunch them up and release it as ammonium for other organisms to take up. But they have just very interesting biology. How they evolve really determines what they are doing out in the environment. And so I needed to understand the biology of them much more. So after my PhD, I went to work with some mycologists for my postdoc, and that's how I really got into fungi.
And what do you think makes fungi uniquely important compared to bacteria, plants, or animals?
That's a good question. Fungi are, um, I think there's been a lot of interest in fungi from humans for a long time. People have been picking mushrooms for millennia and eating them and using them for medicine and things like that. But our understanding of basic things that fungi do in the world really lags behind our understanding of other organisms. For example, like photosynthesis in plants. folks are still doing research on that, but we understand it a lot better than we understand, for example, decomposition by fungi. And this is a problem because fungi are what I call the heavy hitters when it comes to cycling energy and elements through the biosphere, particularly terrestrial systems, meaning land systems. So if you look in soil, particularly in forests, but in lots of different types of ecosystems all over the world, uh, fungi are the major decomposers of dead plant material or litter. And dead plant material is the biggest source of carbon on land. So if we don't have fungi, decomposition basically stops. Decomposition of natural material like plant material, decomposition of our trash in landfills, it all basically slows to a halt. That means we start to get covered in trash, and all other biological processes on Earth basically stop too. So they're very important. But how fungi do it is relatively poorly understood because there are millions of species of fungi in the world. Most of them are decomposers. In any kind of small amount of soil, so you take a teaspoon of soil, you are going to have probably a couple dozen to a couple hundred different species of fungi in there. And we really don't know what all of them are doing at any particular point in time. So, in that way, they're as a community, they're quite poorly understood. But they drive this very important process in nature that allows us to live the way that we do.
Fungi are like the drivers of carbon and nutrient recycling. And what role do they play in these processes that people often overlook?
Yeah, so they do a couple different things. The best known are they act as decomposers, as I mentioned. So they will they will synthesize these very large enzymes and they will send them outside of their cells. They'll secrete them outside of their cells, and those enzymes will catalyze the breakdown of plant molecules like cellulose or lignin that are major components of vascular plants. And then they will take up the products, the small molecules that are released from that, and they'll use it to grow, to respire, and to reproduce. And that does a couple of things. So one thing that it does is it actually releases carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. Now, this is a natural process that's been happening for at least 1 billion years, and it's part of what makes our Earth warm enough to live. At the same time, though, they also use that carbon to make more fungal cells in soil, for example. And they actually store a very large amount of carbon that way. Some recent estimates are that the carbon stored just in one type of fungus that lives in the majority of terrestrial systems worldwide is the same amount as about a third of our annual CO2 emissions from humans every year. So they can store a lot of carbon just in their own cells by being decomposers. But the other thing that fungi do, well, one other thing they do in decomposition is they release a lot of other elements besides carbon that the organisms around them need to live. So they'll release nitrogen, phosphorus, sulfur, they'll release cations, and they'll release metals that plants and animals need, and other microorganisms like bacteria and archaea need to live. And so these other organisms rely on them, actually, rely on a lot of fungi to do this process of breaking down dead stuff to release these elements for growth. The other major thing that fungi do in the world is they attach directly to live plant roots. And these are called mycorrhizal fungi. Myco means fungus and rhizal means root. And this is a classic type of mutualistic symbiosis in nature. What that means is there's a benefit to both the plant and the fungus. The plant will give the fungus sugars, and in exchange, the fungus will extend its cells into soil, take up water, all these different elements like nitrogen and phosphorus, and give a fraction of it to the plant. And so there's this great exchange of elements that help both partners grow. About 90% of plant families in the world need these fungi to live where they do. They will not live outside without them. So they're really important for plant growth. But a third thing that fungi do, which some of us are probably most familiar with, is that they can act as pathogens. So some people probably have seen The Last of Us, which is not accurate in terms of how people interact with pathogenic fungi. But there are fungal pathogens of animals, including humans, and even more pathogens of plants. And so this is a big problem, for example, in agriculture. Fungi are very closely related to humans, and they're very closely related to other eukaryotes, like other animals and plants. And so it's actually really hard to get rid of fungal pathogens sometimes. So they can cause serious problems in human health, but also in agriculture and other kinds of like urban, like forestry and other industries. So one thing I will say about that is that most fungi are not pathogens. The vast majority of fungi on Earth do not hurt plants and animals. There are a handful that do, and those are some that we know the most about, but the vast majority don't do that, and they do what I was talking about before, for example, like cycle elements through ecosystems.
I'm also curious about what you are currently working on in your research lab.
Ah, yes. So, um, yeah, we're working on a variety of projects related to fungi and their interactions with other organisms in nature.
Mhm.
We focus on ecosystems that are disturbed by humans. So we're really interested in understanding how humans impact fungi, whether it's through climate change, rising air temperatures, for example, elevated CO2 in the atmosphere, um, nutrient pollution, urbanization, wildfire, things like that. So we are actively studying how those sorts of global changes affect fungi. And one of the areas that we are really actively working on currently is understanding how those sorts of global changes affect individual species of fungi and their activities in nature. That's historically been very challenging to measure because most fungi don't make mushrooms. Most fungi are actually microscopic and you cannot see them. It's very difficult to measure their activity because it's entirely chemical. Fungi interact with the world just by secreting chemicals and taking them up, and that's it. And so our work involves a lot of chemistry, a lot of biochemistry, but increasingly what we call multi-omics techniques. So measuring DNA, RNA, and proteins produced by fungi in whole soils or in whole roots or in whole leaves. And then what we do is we take all of that information and we try to determine which species are there and exactly what kind of biochemical pathways they're expressing under these global changes. So that's a big area of work for us. We're also moving into more applied research. So using fungi to restore degraded land, for example, after wildfire, or even in cities during tree planting initiatives like city greening or uh, planting of like biofuels crops in reclaimed land.
Mhm. As you mentioned before, fungal communities are really complex. And with that in mind, What has been the most surprising discovery you made while studying fungal communities?
Uh, I think the most surprising things that I have noticed in the fungi is that they are not really what we think they are. So, what I mean by that is I notice a lot of ecological switching potentially in fungi. What that means is um, fungi that are mycorrhizal, so they attach to these live plant roots and give nutrients to plants. They can act as decomposers under certain conditions. Sometimes those mycorrhizal fungi can switch and become pathogenic on plants. Sometimes decomposers can become pathogens, and sometimes pathogens can switch and be decomposers or be endophytes, meaning living inside of plant tissues. Doing what? We're not sure yet, but the more that I study them, the more I realize that most fungi don't fit perfectly into a box, sort of like people, of what they do in
Mhm.
the world. They are very flexible, they evolve very quickly, even in nature, and um, they're still quite mysterious.
Mhm. Looking ahead, how do you see the future of fungal research, or what excites you most about the future of fungal research?
Um, I do think that the use of a lot of molecular tools to study fungi, that's just getting going. And I think that's going to be very exciting, especially because of the advance in artificial intelligence tools. When you use molecular techniques, for example, like transcriptomics, looking at all the RNA produced by all the fungi in, any kind of sample, like a leaf,
Mhm.
it is completely overwhelming. There are millions and millions and millions of transcripts, and our human minds cannot process it very well. So I am really excited about um, machine learning and artificial intelligence tools to look for patterns in these big data sets that will tell us more about what these organisms are doing out in the world, and also um, just help us understand their basic biology. A lot of fungi in nature have very large genomes, and most of the genes, we don't know what they are or what they code for. But with some of these machine learning tools, we might be able to uh, start to hypothesize some functions for what we call this dark matter in fungal genomes. Another thing that I think is really exciting is people using fungi for their natural ecosystem services. And by that, I mean a lot of fungi can hyperaccumulate metals and can break down organic pollutants. And people have known this for some time, but there hasn't been a ton of interest or a ton of money kind of put into that work. And I think that the more um, cities expand
Mhm.
and industry expands, the more interest we get in things like natural or climate solutions or nature-based solutions to some of our environmental problems, people will look to fungi and learn to use them for that kind of bioremediation. I think they have a lot to offer, and it really hasn't been tapped well yet.
My last question is specifically for my audience. So many of my readers are enthusiasts or early learners, but not professional scientists.
Mhm.
What advice would you give to these people who want to learn more about mycology and maybe even do research one day?
Mm. Yeah, so there's a couple of different ways to get involved. I mean, the easiest way is to just start by going outside. Fungi are everywhere. Fungi are on leaves in the city, a lot of fungi. You can see them with the naked eye.
Yeah.
There are fungi, mushrooms, mushroom forming fungi growing on street trees in the city, puffballs and artist conch and all sorts of mushrooms right in the sidewalk. You'll often see mushrooms growing. I encourage people to just go explore. Go to your local park, go to a local nature reserve, and just walk around, but look at the ground. Yeah. Look at the ground and see what you find. You'll find all sorts of cool stuff. And I encourage people to really explore. Wear gloves if your skin is sensitive, but like pick them up. Mushroom picking doesn't actually do much damage to the fungal community in nature because the mushroom is like the fruit of, the fungus.
Mhm.
The rest of the fungus grows as cells underground or in wood, for example. So just take it up, take a look at it, look really close. You can smell it. You can, draw pictures of it. You can save it and dry it out. Just explore because they're so interesting and fun. The other things I would suggest are, get connected with a local mushrooming group. They're all over the United States and all over the world. Boston Ecological Club is a great one here in Boston. They're extraordinary. They have a lot of deep knowledge of the local mushrooms. And they have great seminars, they have newsletter. It's just a wonderful community to be part of. And I'll tell you, you're going to learn a lot hanging out with them. The last thing I would say is like if you're really interested in research, reach out to a lab and see if they'll take a volunteer. You know, People who study fungi have a great diversity of things that we're working on. We look at them under the microscope, we'll do mushroom surveys, we will study herbarium collections in museums, we will do molecular work on roots and leaves and soils to try and detect them through DNA and RNA. So there's all sorts of things you can get involved in if you just reach out.
Thank you so much for speaking with me today. I really enjoyed learning about your experiences and your insights, and I believe all this information will be very valuable to my audience.
Great. Well, thank you so much for inviting me. This was a lot of fun.